The following presentation was given at the Creativity and Madness Conference in Santa Fe, New Mexico in August 2017. I'm Dr. Art Rosengarten. I'm an author, artist, and Jungian Psychologist. Jungian, that's tarot-based Buddhist Jungian. And I'd like today to talk about what I call From Rainbows to Sandcastles, the making of a 21st century tarot. And specifically, my deck, Tarot of the Nine Paths, Advanced Tarot for the Spiritual Traveler, as it's called, or more simply, TNP, Tarot of the Nine Paths. The key points that I would like to discuss today are, one, that the power and reach of visual symbols. Also, why tarot cards, and the tarot itself is a potent psychological instrument for the present age and beyond, I believe. And what oracles do psychologically to things. Finally, a bandwidth of higher consciousness called vision logic. The two symbols, the key symbols of this presentation are the rainbow and the sandcastle, obviously. But also, we'll talk a little bit about the symbolism of caves, lightning, and sand. So let's begin. What are tarot cards? The answer is information, embossed on laminated cardstock, but a particular kind of information, and that would be symbol information. Now, symbols, we could say, reveal the luminous particular. Another world shines through ordinary experience when we approach and work with a living symbol. We see these in tarot cards particularly. It opens up what I think of as a rainbow realm. It's kind of like a rainbow, really, a tarot card. We'll talk more about why it is like a rainbow. It's momentary and supramundane, among other things. And in terms of visual images, there are great advantages over words. As Alan Watts tells us, the ear cannot detect as many variables at the same time as the eye, for sound is a slower vibration than light. Visual imagery freeze frames complex information for extended reflection and study. As we can see certainly in a reading of tarot cards where a number of symbols are taken out and left to be apprehended. Art in general doesn't reproduce the visible, as the artist Paul Klee wrote. It renders visible. This is a very key point. see in his famous painting, Red Balloon, back in 1922. Art generates a kind of imaginal travel. And again, the theme that we'll be coming back to is that it creates a kind of rainbow realm of perception. Now with tarot cards, beneath all the lore and the mystification, we really have a deck that I think of as the Essential Tarot, which is a deck of, symbolically speaking, sunlight and moonlight. And in the sun card, in this symbol of the sun, we see the yang, we see awareness, light, energy, the masculine, vitality, power. And in the moon, we see the opposite, the yin, the unconscious, the dark, mystery, the feminine, the imaginal. And of course, we see lunacy in the moon, which is really one of the very special qualities that the tarot offers us, which many other tools fail to offer, and that is the madness of the human mind and the creativity of the deep psyche is depicted in images in the tarot deck as well, not bypassed like many systems do. We can kind of get a flavor of that lunacy in this particular image of the moon from the illuminated tarot. And I want to show a second image here of the moon, which I think is very instructive. This comes from a newer deck. It's called the New Vision Tarot. It's a very clever tarot deck because it takes the familiar Rider-Waite images, and the artist has added what's not seen in the card but is implied or is in the background of a particular card, which I believe is a lot of what tarot divination does in general. It pulls out what is in the background. It pulls out the unseen and it opens it up to awareness. Here's another example from this interesting tarot deck, New Vision Tarot. Well, here's the classic standard Rider-Waite High Priestess, which I'm sure many have seen before. But look what the artist does here. It's fascinating. So, in terms of what the tarot does in a psychotherapeutic milieu, I've actually created a questionnaire and asked clients who have been through both psychotherapy and tarot therapy with me in private practice. And the most common thing they tell me is that the tarot readings show the bigger picture, which includes, I suppose, not only the foreground, but the background of what's going on. In my book, Tarot and Psychology, I wrote that the tarot is a potentially high-powered psycho-spiritual instrument for the 21st century. And I wrote this because it has so many therapeutic attributes as I see it. Tarot card reading for a psychologist is beautifully useful because it's brief and process-oriented. evocative and numinous, visual, verbal, and nonverbal. It activates intuition, which is akin to this thing called vision logic, which the integral philosopher Ken Wilber has coined this phrase, which I think is very apt. It's adaptable, tarot that is, to many therapy systems. It's cross-cultural, it's timeless, and it's universal. It is, I believe, at least from pilot studies that I've taken myself, valid and reliable. And it's uniquely non-linear and spiritually based, unlike the vast majority of systems of psychotherapy, which are very linear and more, we could say, based on functioning in a contemporary cultural milieu. Finally, one of the most unique features of tarot is that it utilizes synchronicity. We'll talk more about this. James Hillman, the late James Hillman, one of the great American archetypal psychologists and authors who has written many books and was quite a brilliant and articulate teacher of depth psychology. James wrote, rather than developmental psychology, we should study essential psychology, the structure of character, the innate endowment of talent, and the unalterable psychopathologies, in his words. Now, taking that basic idea and applying it to the deck of tarot, we could see the tarot really as a deck that shows the structure of character, the unalterable psychopathologies or life, and the innate endowment of talent. The 16 court cards, they really carry the structure of character, for example, and whether it's the king or the queen, or the knight or the page in any of the four suits comprising the 16 court cards, which remarkably have a perfect correspondence with the 16 personality types of the MBTI, or Myers-Briggs Personality Indicator, which some may be familiar with. Then we have, in addition to the 16 court cards, then we have the 40 pip cards. These are the smaller cards, like we find in playing cards. And to use Hillman's phrase, they represent the unalterable psychopathologies, or in shorthand, the kind of stuff that we all have to encounter as human beings in the course of ordinary life. Here are some examples of the unalterable psychopathologies of tarot. In Tarot of the Nine Paths, which is primarily a major arcana deck that just shows the hierarchies, I have created one card which is called the Four Elements, which in principle contains the entire minor arcana of the tarot in one card. In a kind of a broad brush way, it's called the Four Elements as an agent of quaternity, and by that I mean systems that can be structured in fours. You know, like the four seasons, for instance, or the four elements, or the four tarot suits. And they are, in my view, derivatives of the major arcana, of the higher keys, but extremely important in tarot in general. The minor arcana is. And then let me add that it really is how we experience surface reality. The minors don't really touch down far enough into the pure archetypal realms. They're derivatives, and extremely useful when we're dealing with what I might call domestic issues of relationships and jobs and money and personal issues and family matters, etc. Extremely useful and helpful. And then there are the 22 higher keys, which Hillman calls the innate talents, which is quite an interesting way of viewing the trumps, though I no longer call them trumps due to certain political events that have occurred over the last few years. The word, I believe, has been contaminated from use in the deck of possibility. So we call them the higher keys. For example, the Wheel of Fortune, the Hanged Man. Here is an example of the Hierophant. This is from TNP, which is an agent of spirit. In this deck, in Tarot of the Nine Paths, the archetypal keyword or kind of overarching umbrella principle that describes many facets of a particular higher key is written on the bottom, as in this card, Spirit. So these are the innate talents that we as human beings are endowed with and are really consigned to develop bits and pieces throughout our lives to varying degrees. And the tarot may be a tool that helps us explore and understand more deeply our innate talents. Another way of describing these innate talents is the way that Carl Jung described the cards of the major arcana as the archetypes of transformation. Now, why does tarot work? I mean, it's a great mystery. There's no doubt in my mind or in anybody's mind who has seriously practiced the tarot that it works. It does work. But why does it work? It seems so strange and bizarre. But if you were to ask a true sage or expert in these matters why something like tarot cards work, say Carl Jung, here's a picture of Jung, he would not think that was a particularly challenging question at all. He would say, well, of course tarot works. It works because it's an oracle. This is what oracles do. But if we were to understand oracles from a psychological standpoint for the modern mind, because it is an outdated and somewhat lost idea that in our current setting has kind of gone by the wayside by conventional terms and conventional reality. But the oracle is an extraordinarily valuable tool in voice, in, I guess we could say, transformation of consciousness. Now, what oracles do, psychologically, one, they translate a problem or a question into an image language, like that of dreams. Another thing they do, they mirror. They mirror the unconscious forces shaping any given moment or situation. The background stuff, the unseen things like I talked about before. And finally, they reveal. They reveal that in every symptom, conflict, or problem, an inner spirit is trying to communicate to us. There is something that we need to learn or understand. This is no different than what Freud spoke of about the purpose of neurosis. It's trying to tell us something. It's trying to tell us something about who we really are and how we need to adjust. So in effect, we could say oracles de-thingify an object and transform it into a symbol. Now, symbols, again, we can think of as a rainbow realm. And when we enter into this kind of twilight liminal place that's neither here nor there, it's kind of an imaginal space that symbols and symbol systems like the tarot tend to open up, then the laws of symbolism can apply. We can open up the way we think about normative reality from the perspective of the symbolic universe. And some of the key, I guess we could say, doctrines of symbolism is that, one, nothing is isolated inside its own existence. Everything is interconnected. Two, everything is linked by a system of correspondences. And an object's luminous particular, it's kind of its magical quality, really, is captured and another world shines through, like I spoke of earlier. The most mundane object you can think of, whatever it is, a coffee cup, has also a luminous particular, wherein another world can shine through in the imagination. And symbols express simultaneously the various aspects of the ideas they represent. Now, let's take, this is just a look at some of the symbols in Tarot of the Nine Paths. Let's take this one, the Chariot card, which is an image, or a symbol rather, of the principle of challenge, we could say. Now, when the laws of symbolism apply, we can see that the chariot is a vehicle of transit on one level, but it corresponds to a car, a rocket ship, an ocean liner, a Boeing 747, a bicycle, a mule, a crane, a map, a tray, an algorithm, a referendum, an education, etc. All vehicles of transit, we could say. This is how symbolism expands and texturizes and layers reality. We see that things are interconnected. oracles tend to gravitate to the unseen and unexpected. And I like to think of the analogy of the miner, where the miner basically his purpose is an extractor of the known, we could say. He goes into the mine, and what is he looking for? Coal or diamonds maybe, gold, whatever. He knows it's down there. Now he's going to look for it and bring it back. So he is an extractor of the known. Whereas the oracle is an extractor of the unknown. He goes down into the mine, or she goes down into the mine, but has no idea what's down there. And when he sees it, may not even be able to really make out what it is until he brings it back out to the light of day to apprehend it or to experience it and to learn from it. Now, the difference between the miner and the oracle in many ways is parallel to the difference between Freud and Jung. Freud definitely was an extractor of the known. He knew that there were, Oedipal complexes down there. There was penis envy down there, and there was all kinds of, psychosexual traumas down there, and by golly, he went down there to find them and bring them out. Jung, on the other hand, didn't know what was down there and believed that it certainly was not the known, but rather a rich, magical universe that could be discovered and brought into the light for deepening one's sense of self and life, really. A true symbol, according to Jung, was always something mysterious and unknown until explored in the light of day. Now, caves, I think, are interesting symbols and related to our conversation here about depth psychology and oracles in particular. In the cave's complete darkness, the dramatic symbol of light is forcefully manifest. Traditional miners who go down into mines compared the art of drawing precious metals out of the earth where gestated in caverns to the art of obstetrics, of bringing out babies into life. Psychologically, a cave is a place for psychic incubation. Now, this is my cave where I incubated, we could say, my tarot deck. It happens to be my wine cellar in Encinitas, California, which I converted into a sand play therapy room. I call it the sand room, where I would bring clients down the steps. My kids would call it the dungeon, and they would encounter shelves and shelves and shelves of miniature objects, and a sandbox, which is not in this picture, where I would ask them to select items, put them in the sandbox spontaneously without giving much thought, and then sit down and we would kind of sit and meditate on it, if you will, because what they likely have created is a scene in the sandbox that is reflecting their inner psychological landscape. So here's an example, for instance, of a sandbox or a sand play therapy scene. And now in the sand room, I also would bring my tarot students down there, and we would also take out the tarot cards and make experiments with tarot reading, and sometimes blend it with sand play therapy. I don't know that it's ever been done like that before, quite. And this, I found, was the place where I could really incubate my ideas about the tarot and symbols and oracles, etc., with the psychological technique of sand play therapy, which happens to be the medium from which I created TNP. So I would get some scenes that I would do this consciously, playing with certain motifs to see what tarot cards coming out of this three-dimensional method or technique might open up in an interesting way. Eventually I brought it back up into my consulting room where I have my sand play therapy set up, and continued now once I really got a feeling for a way of creating tarot cards out of sand play miniatures in the sandbox. And the process was, well, it was a rainbow realm. It was very magical and numinous, playing with symbols and mixing these parallel kind of tools that open up the archetypes of transformation, we could say. Now, the technique of blending and dialoguing with these different parts of ourselves is akin to, in Jungian psychotherapy, what's called active imagination. The thing about active imagination, it has three key principles. The first is that deep in the unconscious, there's a natural wisdom, given the proper conditions, for the psyche to heal itself through images. Also, when energies in the form of living symbols are touched upon in the personal and collective unconscious, healing can happen spontaneously at an unconscious level. It's just doing the work and we don't even know it. Finally, as a more harmonious relationship between the conscious and the unconscious develops, the ego is restructured and strengthened. Now, these rainbow realms, they're always liminal. Liminal means in between. They're neither fish nor fowl, we could say. This is an illustration, a famous alchemical picture of the liminal realm, I think. Now, things that are liminal would include rainbows. Rainbows are very liminal. They're neither of the natural world normally nor outside of the natural world. They're both. They're in between. Sandcastles, the other half of my discussion now, those also are liminal things. They live for a short period of time. They're created, out of sand. They can be magical, beautiful structures, And they probably by the end of the day will be washed away or knocked over by some kid running through them. So they're very in between also. Dreams are liminal, hypnosis, liminal. Sand play, as I've spoken, is liminal. Meditation itself is a liminal realm, unless we are permanently in the meditative state, which is impossible. Divination with tarot and the I Ching and other divinatory tools, liminal. Drugs, altered states through various drugs, both hallucinogenic, psychoactive drugs, or a whole range of medicines and other sorts of drugs that people take. They do generate liminal spaces of experience. Also, OBEs, that's out-of-body experiences, very liminal. Near-death experiences, etc. So, the thing about rainbows and liminal things in general is they're occurring temporarily between two ordinary conscious baseline states. Now, when we think of liminal, we may reference the classic work of the French ethnographer Van Gennep in terms of rites of passage. He coined that phrase back in 1909, and he identified 3 universal phases of maturation, of which the liminal phase was the middle phase, or the threshold phase. Those 3, according to Van Gennep, were separation, the liminal, and incorporation. This basic idea was significant and important in psychological development in the post-Freudian psychoanalytic schools, with the very key concept of separation individuation as kind of a central dynamic that can describe maturation through the lifespan psychologically. The liminal phase is well known to psychotherapists and analysts also for a variety of reasons. The Jungians, for instance, let me go back there. The Jungian psychologists, they describe the individuation process as a liminal process, because it begins with a withdrawal from normal modes of socialization and the breakdown of the persona. Initiating a liminal dimension of awareness. Carl Rogers, one of the fathers of humanistic psychology, describes the out-of-this-world quality that many therapists know, a sort of trance-like feeling in the relationship that client and therapist emerge from at the end of a therapeutic hour, as if from a deep well or tunnel. If you've been a client in psychotherapy, you may relate to this. Coming out of a powerful session, it's kind of a liminal place psychologically. The French psychoanalysts speak of the intermediate space, or the excluded middle, or between, that figures importantly in psychoanalysis. When we're talking about the liminal, because we're also talking about rainbows and tarot cards, and we will be talking about sandcastles as well. These are all liminal expressions. And how does one relate to this mid-world, this middle place, this in-between place of the liminals we can see in these very liminal tarot cards from the great Vertigo tarot deck? What we do is we need to apprehend them directly, not comprehend, not interpret. That happens later. What's more important when we're working with this precious in-between state, we need to experience it as it is without interpreting it. We need to just be with it, if you will, and allow it to have its own direct impact on us. That's a very important lesson for the tarot and for tarot readers and querents. It's very important that before any interpretations and comprehensions are made, that there is enough time for apprehending, directly perceiving. So questions such as, what might this be? Or what feels like this in your life? Or what feels like this in yourself? Very good questions to open up that apprehension of direct perception of the liminal. Now, the Osho Zen Tarot deck, one of my favorite decks, a wonderfully beautiful deck, it really has captured the rainbow quality of the tarot. In fact, the authors of the deck write that in using the rainbow, which they have given the whole suit of pentacles or earth in this deck, they call them the suit of rainbows, which is interesting. They say, in using the rainbow, which bridges the earth and sky, matter and spirit, we remind ourselves that in reality there is no separation between the lower and the higher, that indeed it is a continuum of one total energy. So the cards that we see in the Osho Zen Tarot have these kind of rainbow in-between quality. They kind of appear, and then, like I've just done, they kind of fade back, but they don't disappear. They're rainbow-esque. Here's another example. You know, they have this liminal quality, and then when we move on to another card, it just kind of recedes. And this is like what a tarot reading is. These kind of magical, luminous symbols come, we get them, and then they kind of step back a little bit, but they don't disappear. Now in my deck, TMP, I really wanted to get this quality of the rainbow-esque quality using sandplay after all. I mean, sandplay is itself a very liminal tool, and all the images in my deck are really miniatures taken from my sandbox sandplay shelves. I have thousands of them, and played with in a sandbox until I created just the right scene, digitally photographed it, and then layered and worked with it artistically in Photoshop, actually. But to view these cards with that same kind of liminal quality where they kind of arise and then they kind of recede, I think that really captures what I like about this deck and about the tarot in general. Rainbows, now, rainbows are so interesting. Scientific facts about rainbows. Scientifically, we see that rainbows are optical and meteorological phenomena that cause spectrums of light to appear in the sky when the sun shines onto droplets of moisture in Earth's atmosphere. We know that rainbows always appear in the section of sky directly opposite the sun. And if this is fascinating, it's impossible for an observer to maneuver to a rainbow at any angle other than its customary 42 degrees. Who knew? Also, if one observer sees another observer who seems under or at the end of a rainbow, the second observer will see a different rainbow further off. Fascinating. A rainbow is not a physical object and cannot be approached physically. However, though it's not a thing per se, not a physical object, not a thing per se, it is indeed a natural phenomena. It is part of nature, is it not? So rainbows are, all tarot cards are rainbows in my opinion, and oracle wisdom is a rainbow realm, plain and simple. That's when you do a tarot reading, you're entering a rainbow realm, which is at once exquisite, numinous, serene, colorful, seen by multiple observers simultaneously. Note that multiple observers simultaneously, it's not just in your head. Magical and supra-mundane, but also highly delicate, mysterious, and short-lived. Yeah, that's what a tarot and a rainbow is. Now, what often is associated with rainbows is that they're often preceded by thunder and lightning. And lightning in particular is a fascinating symbol. Witnessing lightning is well known to churn up a whole slew of internal reactions. If you've ever been very close to lightning, you know what I'm talking about. In essence, lightning ignites our deeper selves, our more instinctive selves, we could say. Lightning bolts of pure energy tap primal, basic emotions and are power symbols in many of the great traditions because of this. Tibetan, Norse, Native American. In tarot, the Tower cards, bolts of lightning, can be seen as both destructive and creative. So let's take a look at the Tower card. Sometimes it was traditionally called the lightning-struck tower in tarot, back in its earlier incarnations. And we can see the power and the chaos and the just danger and upheaval present in this symbol. So here with those lightning bolts, we can see the destructive aspect of lightning in this particular artistic execution of the Tower card. But it's interesting to note that in the older, far older classic Marseille Tarot, this is coming from the Dodal Tarot, 1700, lightning is seen in a much more kind of quixotic and playful and magical way. The tower itself, this is a very old card. This is over 300 years old, but you see that the destructive quality of the tower originally had more of a creative, playful sense of kind of a deconstructiveness of kind of taking things apart and letting them dissolve in a more playful way, creative way. Here's the tower card in TNP, and it tries to blend both the destructive and the creative aspects of lightning and the tower card in general. So in creating a tarot deck, typically the artist wants to start with, paints and canvas. But in my case, my canvas was pretty much the empty sandbox, therapeutic sandbox. This is what a therapeutic sandbox looks like in Jungian samplay therapy. And it's really akin to an open canvas, a blank canvas. The miniature objects become like the paints, and they are located in the shelves. So these are not my shelves, but my shelves look somewhat similar to this. These are the shelves of actually the creator of samplay therapy, Dora Kauf, the Swiss psychoanalyst who created Jungian samplay therapy in the 50s, I believe, under supervision with Carl Jung. And the thing is, in samplay therapy, the objects, all the miniature objects, are thought to represent everything in the world, everything that has been, and everything that can be. It's a pretty wide set of possibility when you think about it. Okay. So sand is also intimately tied to TNP because it was built in a sandbox and was processed in the rainbow realm of sand play therapy. Sand is another important symbol in this work. Sand opens the door to the unconscious world. Playing spontaneously with sand stimulates the intuitive, non-rational level. Children, of course, have always delighted in playing in the sand, bringing their inner and outer worlds together through imagination. And different cultures have also used sand in imaginal rituals of visioning. Tibetan Buddhist monks, and classically, will spend weeks creating the Kalachakra sand mandala, which is used for contemplation and initiation in tantric practices. And then when it's completed and the ritual has completed, they've created a sandcastle, we could say, a mandalic Tibetan Buddhist sandcastle, if you will. And then it dissolves into nothing, and then it disappears. Very liminal. That's a liminal reality. You got to be there like a rainbow. You go through, it has a process and it has a structure, and it definitely generates a deep experience, like a tarot reading. but it's temporary. And when it's over, it dissolves into nothing. So sand was an excellent medium to create a tarot deck for me, certainly. It was super mundane, constructed in a cave, highly liminal, and impermanent. Now, back to the tarot in general, we might say that tarot always begins in confusion. Okay. And in fact, this card, which I called the Traveler and added it to the deck, suggests that all the voices in our heads, all of the noise that we carry all the time, is kind of the unconscious condition of modern man. And when this card comes up in a reading, it signals, look, I know I'm a head case, I'm a human being after all, but I recognize that there will be value in stepping onto a spiritual pathway, whether it's tarot or meditation or yoga or whatever one needs to do. And that's what the Traveler card in general represents in TMP. But in my own personal confusion, I have this fantasy of my mother imago. Not my mother so much, but the one that's inside my head. My mother's passed quite a long time ago. And my mother imago, we all have a mother imago, do we not? Yeah. And she says, why are you doing all this? You know, I just gone through the tarot cards and the sandbox and all this stuff, etc. And my mother imago says, why are you doing all this? I mean, what's this all about? And when my fantasy is, I would say, well, oh, Mother, it's kind of like this. You see, I've detected a problem with the sacred canon. I'm referring to the major arcana of the tarot, of course, the canon of 22 formerly called trump cards, the higher keys. And I've done all this because there is a problem which I call the overbite. You see, after many years of studying this, I've come to believe that there are 5 missing cards. Why else could there be 22 cards that when we lay them out in rows of 9, the third row comes out short? Now, there are reasons to lay them out in the rows of 9. This is a discussion which is largely the subject of my new book, Tarot of the Future. And I can prove very easily why the tarot was meant to be laid out in 3 rows of 9, the major arcana. But obviously, the deck has been incomplete. The third row is only halfway done. We see this in even the modern decks based on the Rider-Waite. There are missing 5 cards, particularly when we begin to understand that these 3 rows, which I call X, Y, Z, they show pathways that are encoded in the tarot, and that they are each separated, each card with the card below it and the card below it is separated by the number 9. We begin to see that the tarot deck is a highly encoded magic square that has hidden information in it that is there's far more going on in the major arcana than meets the eye. We certainly can say this. Now, even with the rather superficial changes that Arthur Waite did by reversing the 8 and the 11 for astrological reasons, which makes sense. So now the Justice card, which was 11, is now the Strength card, which was the 11 in the original deck, is now the Justice card in the 11th spot, and the Justice card, which I'm screwing this all up. Okay, now the Strength card used to be 11, now it's the 8. The Justice card used to be the 8. There we go. Is now trump 11 or key 11. But that's superficial. That's not that big a deal. Those two cards are fairly similar. It doesn't really make all that much of a difference. But what I've done in the TMP matrix is actually to develop a method of divining these 5 missing spots on the bottom row from key 22 to 26 to complete the deck, so that we have a completed matrix of 3 rows of 9, and no longer that terribly unpleasant overbite. And I won't go into it in great depth here, but the whole principle that was used behind it has to do with the magical properties of the number 9. Very interesting study. If we look at how 9s work when we apply what's called mystic addition or numerological Vedic addition, they do things that no other number does, and they actually reveal. The tarot, in my opinion, is truly a deck about 9ness. The 3 pieces of 9ness that I've learned are through the magical properties of number 9, a something behaves like a nothing. Through increase, one returns to essence, very paradoxical, and through we expand with conscious retention of root value. This is all discussed in my work and in my book. I'm not going to slow this down now with this rather complex conversation. Read my book, Tarot of the Future, or get my deck. It's all explained in there. This is what the new matrix looks like with the missing cards, etc. But there's another reason. There's another reason I would tell my mother Imago, forget all of that. Forget that I wanted to complete the tarot deck as totally beyond arrogance, such a such a task, such a claim. I know suggests, but I have done that. But there's something else that is maybe as telling. It's something that occurred about 50 years ago that nobody's talking about and has to be confronted. There was a paradigm shift that occurred in 1962. You may recall it was the Jetsons. Now, the Jetsons carried the myth of high tech that pretty much on the popular collective cultural level defined and determined the whole course of modern culture over the last 50 years. The myth was that the Jetsons are a regular family living in a futuristic utopia of elaborate robotic contraptions, aliens, holograms, and whimsical inventions. You remember all that. But when we actually get to know them, the Jetson family, we discover that, you know what, inside they're still the Flintstones. So, ain't that like the way it is today? It's the high-tech myth. And, you know, in this Smithsonian, on Smithsonian.com, has written, I found, about the Jetson. It says from the Smithsonian Institute, it's easy to dismiss the Jetsons as a TV show and a cartoon at that. But this little show, for better or worse, has had a profound impact on the way Americans think about the future. And I call it the Jetsons effect. And what the Jetsons effect is, it means that our perceptual faculties remain unevolved, but their modeling gets sleeker and perhaps better organized. In my book, I've spent a lot of time talking about this problem. With the Jetsons effect, we have no credible way of imagining the future at all, I believe. Any futurescape that imagined from the narrow and suspect frame of our current paradigm, including science, including politics, including everything, will only address surface level formations, privilege physical destinations, give primacy to the past, and be lacking in genuine transformational change in consciousness. This is very important. It's like smart things. We could see tarot cards. You know, my book called Tarot of the Future, some may imagine, you know, smart tarot cards or tarot cards, you know, of the future looking like this, maybe. That smart things are really not that smart. They are absent of the fourth dimension, that being the evolution of consciousness, which we can call the stage one being vision logic. Now I can get on to talking about vision logic. Vision logic is the first step, according to the work of Ken Wilber, that moves from normal, rational, formal operations of your adult thinking, normal mind into the kind of transition into higher levels of perception. In vision logic, we enter into what has been called the higher mind, perhaps. It's dialectical, integrative, and synthetic thinking. It establishes networks of relationships. This is the highest structure of the personal realm. It's synchronistic, non-linear, and systemic. And obviously, certainly to me, it is the realm that opens up when we read tarot cards. we all of a sudden suspend our disbelief, and there is a kind of shifting that takes place into vision logic. Now, when we talk about cognitive levels of development, certainly we begin with the work of Jean Piaget, who is still kind of the father of cognitive developmental psychology, who is standard text in contemporary psychology, stages of cognitive development, ending off in formal operational from 12 to adult. That's where we get fixed, where we're able to have abstract reasoning and have fully developed moral thought and deductive logic from the general to the specific, and that's as far as we go as men. The formal operations, we are here, okay? These are called the higher cognitive functions by neuroscientists and neuropsychologists who covet these areas that we all see as the mature, superior thinking of the adult mind, emphasizing the gaining of knowledge and comprehension, knowing, remembering, judging problems, all wonderful things. But there is post-rational development. It doesn't stop there, though it certainly has stopped in contemporary mainstream psychology, unfortunately. Save for the teachings and writings of Ken Wilber and many others who have followed in his tracks, who have continued to look at post-rational development of consciousness. And Wilber discusses in great detail what happens next, beginning with vision logic, as I described it, and there's kind of a natural loosening and kind of organic shifting to subtler and subtler levels of consciousness organically, from vision logic to the psychic, from the psychic level to the subtle, and from the subtle level to what's called the causal level of consciousness, which is certainly the target of most of the mystical religions of the East. Effortless, described as effortless insight culminating in nirvana, for instance. And the ultimate goal has been called many things. I prefer the phrase, the unconditioned mind, or it could be pure non-dual awareness. Now, but vision logic, as far as tarot, that's all we really need to kind of focus on. We don't need to go to these other esoteric states of consciousness in the beginning, though tarot will take us there eventually. With vision logic, it's described there's a gradual shifting of emphasis from thinking to seeing in higher levels of consciousness. There is a dissolution, a dissolving of the embeddedness in the subject-object relationship, meaning the, I would say, misattribution that we are inside here and you are out there. we are separate from the world, we are separate from the other, we are here and you are there. That is the subject-object relationship that we are embedded in, which unfortunately carries a lot of blind spots. We can understand some of its limitations, but there are parts of our own self where our ego is invested in the subject-object relationship and cannot see what the unseen, cannot see the background, like we talked about in the past. So with vision logic, there is a freeing from being imprisoned in a subject that stands in a certain qualified relationship to the objects of awareness. Now, vision logic draws upon the power of pictures. It's synchronistic, like the tarot. It's non-linear, like the tarot. It's systemic. It also facilitates direct apprehension of the object without interpretation. Just be with it. How then does one read these cards? Well, imagine a rainbow and experience that liminality of a rainbow realm. Maybe you can meditate a moment on rainbows, or that sense of being in a creative process where time stops and you're just in the zone. Maybe it's daydreaming. And then randomly select some cards, such as these cards. And once they're out, apprehend them directly. You may ask the questions, what might this be? What feels like this in your life? What feels like this in yourself? This is divination. You can use a spread if you like. There's a spread. You can use it 3 cards or 5 cards or a 10-card Celtic cross spread, which is the bread and butter of tarot reading spreads, I believe. And finally, and I know I've said quite a bit, but these are the questions that you may have that this presentation has been about. Its applicability to psychotherapy, how it was, the TMP was created by the oracle itself in a liminal space, using active imagination to open the doors of vision logic and make a tarot of the future. I think that's probably plenty for now. I thank you for giving me a chance to spout out about the project I've been involved with for the last 10 years, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure.